Welcome, everybody, to
Okay ba?
week 5 of Art 1.2. We're going to finish up the couple of slides we didn't get to last week because we didn't have class on Monday, so I need to do a little catch up. But the good news for all of you is I'm cutting a few of the slides as we go, which I already said I do. You know, it's the first day of class. I mentioned that. So those won't even be something you have to read about or study. But then much more will be cut, 40% of the total from the original syllabus before the midterm and again before the final. So that gives you some kind of an idea of, let me let these other couple more people in here. Welcome. We just started. Yeah, I have a couple of brief announcements to make, and then we'll get started with today's lecture. One of the things that I find interesting is how many creative ideas my students have for extra credit within the parameters of what's already, mentioned. For instance, one of my students asked if she could watch a movie about Van Gogh that was made in Europe with his original style of drawing. It's sort of it's hard to explain. It's half cartoon and half live action. You may have heard of it. Love Van Gogh, I think it's called. You could look it up. Yeah, things like that would qualify because that's about a period of his life toward the end of his life when he was creating his most famous paintings. And even though it's a bit of a romantic angle, which as far as we know, he only had one intimate relationship during his years as a painter, at least. This might be a fictional, angle, but I've seen it. It's a good movie. So anytime something, in other words, anytime you guys have a question about whether a certain museum or a certain, film about an artist's life or style of art or architectural site, those are pretty straightforward. But if you're just not really sure if it'll qualify, just raise your hand or speak up in class, right? Here we go. Or of course, send me an email and I can always confirm. I try to be as flexible as I can. So in other words, there's so many new movies coming out about artists now. I think it's exciting. 15, 20 years ago, there weren't that many. There were some old ones and then a few every year. But now it's like all the time. There are new movies about all kinds of artists. In fact, any documentary or film over 1 hour that covers something about the life or work of any artist or any style of art qualifies for that 10 points, where you write 2 pages, right, about what you learned from that film, about either that artist or that type of art. Okay, I hope that's helpful. But before we get started, any questions? Your papers are due. Let me go ahead and do the full. Yeah, your papers are due 1 week from Wednesday. So you have 9 days. By now, hopefully, everyone has gotten their start and should be writing, actually working on or organizing your research. Okay, let's get the speaker view going here. Okay.
Sorry, I do have a question. It's for
Sure.
the first paper?
Pardon?
It's the first paper or is the second one?
Yeah, there are 2 papers. The first one is due, it's in your syllabus, but I always send out reminders. In fact, I will send the cover sheet to everybody on Wednesday, and if anyone doesn't get it, I'll be able to follow up if you send me an email. Hopefully you will, though. I tried to get a hold of IT, by the way. A couple of, I think it was this class, noticed that people who join the class late, I've had like 4 or 5 students after even the second week, and I welcome that. But somehow they're supposed to keep the handouts, the attachments, the PDFs, on the student portals until Labor Day weekend. That's what I scheduled it for, and they weren't. And nobody got back to me. I called and emailed. I don't know if it's staff shortages or they're overstretched or their budget's been cut, but it's frustrating because so that means a few of you, especially if you join the class late, may have, not gotten all the handouts. Although I've been following up on that. Every time I get a request, I say, well, which ones do you not have? Because I don't want to send you 7 or 8 all at once if you only needed 3 or 4. So if anyone doesn't get, the next handout will be the cover sheet for the paper. I will send that to everybody, maybe even tomorrow. So you have it with you when you're writing your paper. And then of course, any other questions you have, obviously and you can still send me a sample of what you've written, as long as you don't wait till the night or 2 nights before it's due. It's best to give me at least 48 hours notice if you choose, and I'll give you feedback and say, if you're missing something, this part's fine, but you need to add X, Y, or Z. I can do that as long as you give me a few days notice. So that's another option. But if you don't want points off for being late, they need to be done and submitted by, I give you till midnight on the day the papers are due, which is a little extra time in case questions occur to you during the day they're due in class. But midnight's a cutoff, they'll be counted late after that, but I'll still accept them. It just, you have some points off, and it's best if you don't have that happen, if you can get them done in time. Now, any other questions about, some people joined the class only in the last 1 or 2 weeks, so maybe they weren't 100% sure on the requirements or any work of art. Hopefully everyone now has picked one that you like, that has enough facts that you can find in your research, whether it's online or in an actual original print edition that's now a digitalized version of a whatever, encyclopedia, a book, a magazine, newspaper. Anyway, 3 new sources. Remember, that's a requirement for an A, that aren't from just the 2 we have already in class, Stockstead and Gill. Now, you can use them, but if you want an A in the bibliography, you need to have at least 3 other new sources. I think we've covered all that, so I don't want to rehash too much because we need to get to the slides. But again, I'll stick around afterwards. I always do, as long as there are any questions. But does anybody have any right now they want to ask about the papers or anything we covered in the last couple of lectures? I posted that lecture, if you missed it, by the way, I think early. I think it was on Thursday. Anyway, certainly before the weekend, from last Wednesday, which is late Renaissance or mannerism. And I've already defined that. That's in that lecture. Anybody have any questions now they need to ask?
For the books, for the printed, like you want a printed edition or something.
Something that once was printed, it'll say on the website of, the digitalized, like online version of Encyclopedia Britannica. That's a good example. Now there's not just totally dedicated website. Wikipedia, I've said this many times, has gotten so much better. Some teachers won't let you use it, will they? Yeah, but I do. However, it can't be your only source or only internet's only websites. So just give at least one of your 3 new sources. You could have more if you want, but at least one should be originally in a print version. And that's easy to find. You guys are better at that than I am. I'm sure when you Google for finding a book, a magazine article, a newspaper, a museum brochure from an exhibit about that artist's work, there's so many ways you could find things. And then that would be an original print source. And you just put that in parentheses in your bibliography, actually. There we go. Always have to do this backwards, yeah.
But my question is, does the printed have to be from that era, from the when he?
No, yeah, it can be from more recent. Of course, it wouldn't be from before, right? Art was created anytime, yeah, from whenever, contemporary, in other words, you mean, or later, yeah. What are you thinking? You have a piece of art in mind? I mean, unless you.
Well, yeah, because I'm doing Saturn devouring his son from Goya, Francisco Goya, and I found a bibliography, but it's more written in a contemporary time where it goes over his life and things like that from the beginning. So I was just wondering if I can use that as the book, or do you want like?
Yeah, you
could.
Perfect. He was so famous; his artwork was seen all over Europe. He helped bring Napoleon down. Well, slightly stretching to say one artist helped bring down the worst dictator up until that time. In the 20th century, they got even worse. Napoleon killed over 5 million people, and he invaded 20 countries. I mean, he's supposedly a hero to some people, but not to me and most people I know who. I've read many biographies of him. He was a military genius and a mass murdering dictator. So Goya didn't like that. So he risked his life through his art to encourage rebellions against him. And so that is an interesting, I'm not going to give away too much, but that piece you just mentioned has so many layers of meaning. You should have no trouble finding an original source that was printed, but it doesn't have to be from that period. It can, or it could be later. Okay.
Thank you.
Any other questions before we get started? Because we want to get to the slides now, of course. The first artist, I'm going to go ahead and tell you, this artist is one of the most important of the last 500 years, and I'll bet most of you have not even heard of him. And I'm going to prove to you how far he was 4 or 5 centuries ahead of his time. And the reason that I emphasize him as much as I do, there are 2 reasons. One is he was, at the time of his life, he was a German Renaissance painter named Albrecht Durer, D-U-R-E-R. At least some of you must have heard of him. He's pretty famous. One of the slides, it's a must know, we'll get to. It's about the 3rd slide. So you don't have to take notes yet, right? But when we get to that slide, I'll summarize what I'm saying about who he was. He was nicknamed the Da Vinci of the North. So if you want to start taking notes for the must know, that's part of the meaning is, of course, always what the artist's reputation was. Durer was nicknamed by his contemporaries, you know, other artists and critics. There were art critics back then, as the Da Vinci of the North. That's a high compliment. Da Vinci was the most famous man alive in Europe, at least at that time, right? And so he was multi-talented. In other words, he didn't only paint, he was an engraver, right? He was also a writer, an essayist, and he even did nature studies, which you're going to see a little evidence of. And he also was a social activist in a very low-key way. I mean, he didn't go out and march with signs and things. That wasn't normally what people did back in the 1500s. But he did make statements about social injustice, and that's why I admire him so much. So this is not the must know. I took this slide. It's in the Louvre. It's of him. It's a self-portrait when he was 28 years old. So he was just getting started in his painting and engraving. Those are the 2 things he made the most success in. You know, he was able to sell his works of art. Of course, engravings could be reproduced, so they were a long-term source of income, but he was never wealthy. And part of the proof of that is the way he's dressed. That's a simple linen shirt, which a very successful or wealthy artist would be wearing something much fancier than that. And then he has some kind of a yarn, I think that's what that is, yarn on top of his head. It's not a fancy cap with a feather and, you know, brocade silk or, you know, gold brocade. So he was never wealthy, but he did have to support his mother, who lived with him most of his adult life, and a wife, and several other people, I think in-laws. So he was never well off financially. That wasn't his goal. Neither was Da Vinci. So in that regard, they had that in common. The other reason I admire him is a bit, 1 or 2 of you may have noticed. Look at his eyes. One eye is not focused the same on us, the viewer. He did this, of course, from a mirror. What else would he have done? How else would he have done that? He had strabismus, which I always resented the phrase lazy eye syndrome, but that's what people often call it. And that's just an ignorant phrase. You're born with it. One eye doesn't focus as well as the other, and only expensive surgery when you're quite young. And there's no way he could have done that. He was born to, you know, lower middle class family. Even if they'd had that surgery back then, I don't think they did. My daughter has it. We adopted her from Russia. She was born with it, and so did Rembrandt. So a lot of successful or happy, well-adjusted people were born with one eye that doesn't focus in line with the other. Usually only happens when they're tired, but his was pretty much constant. And so he would often paint himself looking at us on a side, see this almost like a profile, so you wouldn't notice as much. Okay, that's not anything you had to know, except you should have written that he was nicknamed the Da Vinci of the North because of his multi-talented skills in painting, drawing, essay writing, and social activism. So now, again, this isn't a must know to prove the first point I made about him being, well, you could call him a proto-environmentalist, okay? This is called Little Owl. He signed his work always with his initials, and somehow the number 1 got cut off. It's not 508 AD. That would be after the fall of the Roman Empire. 1508. You have to. It's not the must know. So you could just listen for a few minutes, and we get to the must know. Of course, I always tell you to start taking notes. Look at the quality of the workmanship. How many lines he had to engrave into this one image of a small owl. But the reason he did that was he was creating a journal, and this is where he was way ahead. He was at least 300 years ahead of Audubon. Some of you know who Audubon was. There's an Audubon Society, of course. It's 200 years old now, I guess, from the early 1800s when that guy was alive, doing color paintings of animals in the wild. He was doing these engravings of them in natural settings 300 years earlier, and then writing and having small, numbers of these books published. He wasn't trying to make money. He was just trying to get the concept. We need to preserve our natural environment and not destroy the habitat of plants and animals because we're all intertwined. I mean, how far ahead of other people would you have to be to even think like that in the early 1500s? You see my point. Well, you're going to see more evidence of how far ahead he was. So this is one of a series of drawings he did of animals, not just that were around him in Germany. He traveled all over Europe, but he also went to, they had zoos back then, mostly wealthy, ruling class people had them, small, collections of exotic animals imported from Africa or something. So he drew rhinoceroses, hippopotamuses, accurate down to the last detail, and with some kind of sense of empathy for this. He believed they had souls, they had spirits. Again, that's rather unusual for someone in the European art world of the early 1500s. Okay, this is one of the most amazing pictures he did. Now, the next one is a must know. So you don't have to write this. It's called the Negress Ekaterina. Now, that's the translation from German. This woman was someone that lived in the same city in Germany where he spent most of his adult life, and his studio was, and his family he was supporting. It's Nuremberg, which is a beautiful town, old town in Bavaria. She was probably the only African immigrant living independent and free. She was not either a slave or a servant or indentured or anything like that. She ran a shop for herbal, what today we would call holistic cures, which he would occasionally frequent because both his wife and his mother were sickly quite often. They had ailments that, they didn't know how to cure back then. They were friends. He shows her with respect and accuracy and dignity. And then there's another reason they were friends. Look at her eyes. She had the same condition he had. She had strabismus, so they could relate to each other on that level too. And they remained friends throughout his career. And they wrote to each other sometimes when he was traveling. Again, very unusual for the early 1500s. Okay, now we get to the must know. So you need to take notes. This has a high possibility. I'm not cutting this from the study list. I'll go ahead and tell you that up front. Okay, the title is Melancholia 1. Now, the spelling in English, a few of your sharper-eyed students will notice it's different on the banner, see here, than it is in my syllabus. That's because it's different spelling in German. But if it's on the exam, you'll get credit. And there's the name right there, right, in German. That would be acceptable. But the spelling in English has a CH. Okay, so here we go. On the syllabus, the spelling is Melancholia 1. That's Melancholia. Melancholia 1. Durer. Durer. 1514. Okay, this is maybe in some ways the most remarkable piece he ever did. It's certainly one of his most famous because it is a combination of a plea for understanding of a human condition that people don't choose to be afflicted with. And it's also a self-portrait of him at a point in which his life was affected by this mental state. Melancholia is another way of saying depression, right? Many of you know that. Used to be what they diagnosed people who were bipolar back in even the 1800s, that recently, as having melancholia. They didn't know what that really was. They were just starting to, some scientists were beginning to figure out it was a chemical imbalance that you're born with. And so he wasn't born with it, but most historians think his wife was. That's one of the reasons she seemed to have so many ailments and be depressed so much. And, had difficulty dealing with other people, including him. Maybe his wife was, but we know he went into a severe depression when his mother died. and his business took a downturn. I don't know if it was wars, probably was. There were wars all the time, that part of Europe in the 1500s. Whether it was a war or a recession, somehow he lost most of his clients. He had to give up his studio. In other words, all these bad luck things hit him all at the same time. So he sank into a chronic depression. You know that phrase, some of you, right? Which isn't a inherited condition, right? It's not a genetic depression illness, but it can be just as debilitating. This is him. It's a self-portrait of him as a universal figure. This is a really important part of the meaning. A lot of people look at this and they think, oh, it's him in drag. Maybe he was, no, he wasn't bi or anything like that. That's not the point. He was showing that it could happen to a man or a woman or anyone, regardless, in other words, of gender, to a human being, or yes, he has wings. Even in the Bible, it mentions, right, some parts of the so-called, right, Christian Bible accounts of some of the angels even have serious depressions, right? So it can even strike all kinds of creatures, human or otherwise. Here's a little cherub, right, a baby angel. Look how depressed that baby angel is. And if that's not enough, even the dog is depressed, probably his pet dog or one of them. And then we have the tools around him. This is all part of the meaning. See, he wasn't a stone carver, but he had friends who were, and he respected them. Sometimes he commissioned, pieces for people, busts for himself or his family. So all of these tools, and obviously a stone cutter a sculptor is an artist. So as an artist or kind of an artist, they're idle. They're lying on the ground. He's too depressed to do any of the work. And that's actually what happened to him. See, here he's got the tool that he uses, an engraver. That's actually part of what he used to make these engravings. So he didn't do any work for, I don't know, it was at least a year. He was maybe more. The only thing no one can explain is this here, these numbers. There are all kinds of theories. And I've had students write papers about this, for my classes. And the theories abound. But this, we know what it means. The passage of time, the inevitability of death. He actually died by the time I think it was 60 when he died, which even back then wasn't that long a life. But in any case, he was very cognizant of that. But there is hope in the sky, this shooting star. Now, this odd-looking bat flying with the title of the actual drawing or engraving, Melancholia in German, right, spelled that way, gives you a hint that, maybe, there's all these evil things are coming from outside to affect you, but you have to be strong and get through. So what is here's the last really important part of the meaning of this, why I'm saying this is ahead of its time. Does anybody know how people with mental illness were treated in the Renaissance in the 1500s? Anybody ever even seen any movies or read any books about it?
Yeah. I don't know exactly, but I imagine they're treated pretty poorly.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Horrendously. They were chained to walls, beaten, starved. They were thought to be possessed by the devil and therefore evil and only worthy of, maybe food and water, and locked up and abused, which is just outrageously ignorant, of course, isn't it? So he is here's the bottom line, that you could say in one line, the main reason he created this work of art while he was suffering from depression was to make a plea to people, at least educated, intelligent people, not to treat mental illness like that it can strike anybody at any time, and we should have empathy and understanding. How far ahead of his time is that? Well, I could do the math. Not until around the late 1800s, mid to late 1800s, did you begin to get some doctors, psychologists, and scientists say the same thing. So he's more like 3.5 centuries ahead of his time with this. And it did have, the effect on a few people, like maybe one or two hospitals. They called them hospitals. They were really torture chambers where mental people were locked up in chains. Might have maybe said, yeah, I think I've read a few of them more enlightened directors of those places said, well, maybe we should think that over a bit, not whip them, maybe give them better food and the worst possible, minimal starvation diet. Yeah, because anybody mentally ill back then was considered evil. The devil had possessed them, and so you just mistreat them, and that's was the norm. He was outraged by that and trying to make that statement. Okay, formal analysis is pretty. There's no warm or cool colors. Of course, in an engraving there wouldn't be. It's all black and white and shades of gray. Of course, that makes it neutral. I call it roughly balanced left to right, but top to bottom, this is mostly empty space, even though the wall behind them, the two figures, is solid. So it's unbalanced toward the bottom. The rhythm is very, very obvious. These numbers on the wall, the ladder rungs, the folds in his robes, the objects all around them on the ground, and of course arms, hands, legs. Simulated texture. Well, he was a master at that. His hair and his beard, his face, right? The clothing of both the cherub and him. I mean, even on the village in the background, look how much detail that is. He didn't have to get that detail. It's amazing to me. He did thousands of engravings in his lifetime, at least 2,000. And he only was working for about 40 years. That may sound like a long time, but each one of these took weeks at least. Yeah, that's remarkable. So the simulated texture, superb everywhere. And of course, the modeling, he was obviously a superb or a master at that. Look at that. The shadowing on the robes, especially, and around the arms and hands and faces. Then we have, is it stable or dynamic? Well, I'd say it's both, because the background, the wall behind them, well, actually a building, is stable. And he's seated upright, but then maybe the dog is mostly stable, because almost creates a horizontal figure. But then these objects here, obviously, some people think that's a face. I don't see that, but it could be, but there's no evidence for that. But obviously this round stone ball here, the ladder, the rainbow and the shooting star in the bell, it's a mixture of both stable and dynamic. The techniques for space, pretty straightforward. Overlapping, of course, foreshortening, right, on most of the objects that are behind them, or even on his lap, and diminishing size, clearly, as objects go further towards the horizon. Scientific perspective, he always used that, but there is no atmospheric perspective. It is not a color work of art, so you couldn't use that technique. Okay, let's see. Are we forgetting anything? Balance. Oh, the largest mass is him. And then I guess the building behind them, and then it's a close call, probably this large dodecahedron, I think it is, a multi-sided piece of stone that's sitting idle, and then maybe the dog or the cherub. Okay, let's move on to the next must know. All right, this one is El Greco is the artist, but the title is Burial, B-U-R-I-A-L, of Count Orgaz, O-R-G-A-Z, Burial of Count Orgaz. I know it's an odd last name, right? O-R-G-A-Z. The artist name El Greco, and if you speak Spanish, you know that means the Greek. He was from Greece, but he lived his whole adult life in Spain. E-L, two words, and then capital G-R-E-C-O, 1586. El Greco is considered the greatest of all the Mannerist painters. I already gave you the definition of Mannerism, so if you didn't catch last week's lecture, you do want to watch that and take that definition in your notes. This is an exaggerated set of techniques that El Greco, this painting, I should say, displays, an exaggerated set of techniques that El Greco created as a unique style of his own. So that's what Mannerism is all about, an artist creating their own style with various individual techniques. So what were they? We'll just keep to the two main ones. One is an undulating or swirling motion, and you can see that in the heaven. The upper part of this scene depicts the soul, right, of the recently deceased count, right, named Orgaz. After he dies, it goes up to heaven, supposedly, and Jesus is there to greet him. Well, there are two of the main motifs that El Greco created, and other people imitated for centuries after this, that make this him considered, many historians consider, the greatest of all Mannerist artists. Because you see the swirling motion here in the clouds. In fact, this cloud almost takes on the contours of a giant hand, like the hand, or maybe both of them are, possibly this is more like a fist here, the hand or hands of God, or you could say the arms of God, opening up the entrance to heaven. That's how most historians interpret this part of the painting. But the undulating motion is also on Jesus's robes. In fact, let me, I know I have another view which is close. closer. Yeah, there we go. So if you go up closer, you really can see it now, right? I mean, that's not how, if he's just sitting on, quote, his throne in heaven, or anyone is sitting on a throne of any kind, their robes aren't going to do this. They're not going to lift up over, So that is an exaggerated technique. It's called undulating motion. That's also true of the robes around this angel's legs. You see it in lots of places. And Mary's blue royal robes that mark her as Queen of Heaven, they also have an undulating effect. It's most visible, though, on the two clouds / hands of God, if you want to call them. That's what they probably symbolize. Okay, the other technique that is his own signature, right, motif that makes this a manner of style is elongated limbs on the main figure. Look at Jesus's arm. He could touch his feet sitting down without leaning over. And then this is John the Baptist. Look how long that arm is. That's totally abnormal. And even to some degree, his legs. And here's Peter, supposedly the guy that, was the first disciple from Jesus' followers, right? And here he's up in heaven with keys, right? Supposed to be keys to heaven. Look at his fingers and his hand. They're about twice as long as a normal hand would be for someone of his height. So there are exaggerated details that are body parts, arms, hands, legs, and even sometimes in the heads, or you could just say body parts, that are part of his, it's called elongated limbs, or whoops, went back too far, sorry. So let's look at the whole picture now, though, because what's going on in the bottom is the actual burial or funeral. I mean, it is the funeral and burial in a church in Spain. You don't need to know much about who Orgaz was for the meaning, but just very briefly, he was one of those wealthy nobles who gave money to the poor, not just a little bit, but really did try to help a lot of the poor people in his region or his district of Spain. So the church almost made him a saint. They never did make him a saint, officially, but they gave him a fancy funeral. So here he is. That's him, his body being lowered into the crypt right inside a church. Crypts in the floor of a church, and most of these buildings would have been below where we can see it, right, where the arrow would be. But that is his son. That is not Orgaz's, but that is an actual portrait of El Greco's son, who himself became a pretty successful painter following in his father's footsteps. And then this would probably be a bishop. The Pope, I don't think, came to that funeral, but bishop's pretty important, high-ranking Catholic Church official. The whole point of this painting is to show how the Catholic Church encouraged good works, or helping poor people or innocent people or people in need. At least that's what they want to convey. The idea or image of the church is supposedly doing good works when they rewarded someone like this count. And that was a response to the criticism of the church, is the last fact about the meaning now, of the church by the Protestant Reformation. When the Protestants broke away from the Catholic Church, they criticized it for being corrupt and not caring about the average person, which in many parts of Europe in the early 1500s, there's no denying that was true. So that's why there was a break between those two branches of Christianity. I think most of you know that from your world history, right? This is after that break had happened. So this is a piece of political propaganda on behalf of the Catholic Church, and they commissioned the greatest painter in Spain at that time, El Greco, to try and promote their image, the Catholic Church's own image. Okay, that's plenty on the meaning. It's balanced. Yeah, the host, they call them, of all the holy holies up in heaven, around Jesus's throne, balance out roughly with the mourners and the church officials in the bottom, roughly equal, half top to bottom. And I would say also roughly right to left to right. Yeah. And then the rhythm is obvious with the arms and hands, the clouds here, and the clothing and the robes on the figures, especially in the bottom part where the church officials are. Similar texture, again, with this is after all late Renaissance, right? It's still late Renaissance. It's always going to be super sharp. You can just count on that. If you're writing about a slide on the exam, you don't have to guess about that. It's super sharp. It always would be on any Renaissance style painting. On the heads, faces, hair, clothing, robes, even the armor of the dead body of Count Orgaz, and then up in heaven too on the skin and robes or clothing, if you want to call it that, of the figures in heaven. And the same is true of the modeling in all those same areas, super sharp and realistic. The only place it doesn't have that would be the clouds here. There it's soft and diffused, because clouds, of course, tend not to be, right, super sharp modeling or texture. Or have that. No, because the dynamic or stable. Well, down below, it's mostly stable, except for these three figures here, or lowering the body, and these two church officials leaning over. But even the others standing around them, and all the mourners are upright. But in heaven, it's the opposite. They're almost all diagonals and leaning over, including, of course, the hands of God, or the opening there of the clouds. So upper half is almost all dynamic. The bottom half is almost all stable. All the lines here are thin outlines. And you decide what the largest mass is. If this is one mass, this group here of the three figures, the two people lowering the body, maybe that's the largest mass. If not, perhaps this looks larger than the one on the left, the two clouds opening up into heaven. And then perhaps this man with the white robes on would be the third largest. Colors, warm, of course, on the yellows and golds, neutral on the black and white. Mourners, would wear that type of a color, of course, at a funeral. And up in heaven, that's cool on the clouds, and a mixture of warm and cool on all the other figures. Okay, let's move on to, this is not a must know, but what I thought might be interesting to one or two of you, I'll keep it brief, is these, see what these are? These are olive trees, which supposedly where Jesus was arrested. The Roman soldiers are back there coming to arrest him. It's the night he was arrested after being betrayed, right, by Judas. We talked about that with the Last Supper. We're going to see another Last Supper as the next must know. Before we get to that, this is a scene from the Bible. You'll have to write this. And he's asking God, why do I, have you abandoned me? Why am I suffering? God just says, well, you'll be up in heaven with me soon. So it's a moment of pain and doubt. You see all the undulating effect. Even some people think that's the face of God right here. The eyebrow and eyeball and maybe a beard. It could be. That might be his intention. The reason I show this, besides the details, verify the two, I just covered those two signature motifs of the undulating motions and the elongated limbs, especially on his arms here, at least that's mostly what you see, is the fact that those olive trees, because they are trees, right, are still there in Jerusalem. I went to the place, the Romans kept records, so we don't have to guess on this, whenever they did, especially when they tried and executed somebody. So we know where that garden would have been, where he was arrested. And there are olive trees around the outer edge of it. I took a tour with a historian from the Israeli tourism ministry, and I said, those are the same kind of olive trees, right, that were here according to the Bible when Jesus was arrested by the Romans. And the guy said, no. Oh, really? What kind of olive trees? No, you're missing the point. Those are the same olive trees. They're 2,000-year-olds. I had no idea olive trees could live that long. And then I looked it up, and a couple of friends of mine who were teaching here in botany said, yeah, they can live that long. Okay, this is the next must know. Actually, I forgot I had this. I'll keep this brief because architecture is going to be on, there will be one at least slide on the exam, but I'm not going to say this is so important I absolutely won't cut it or will. Just assume, again, the odds are at least that it might be on the midterm. Villa, two words, V-I-L-L-A, Rotunda, R-O-T-U-N-D-A. The architect's name was Palladio, P-A-L-L-A-D-I-O. Again, P-A-L-L-A-D-I-O. It's, as you can guess, he's Italian. The date is 1569. Let's start with the fact that Palladio is considered the father of the modern, I'll say it slowly and repeat it, profession of architecture. Again, that statement is that he, this architect, was considered to be the father of the modern profession of architecture. That's a pretty amazing statement. Over 400, almost 450 years ago, weren't there architects? Yes, all the way back to ancient Egypt, but there was not a group of, a body of knowledge or texts that you had to study, and tests, and what we say, exams that you have to pass, licensing. And that was his idea, that he created a series of books on architectural principles that anybody, once they were translated, of course, into other languages, could read, and maybe they could become self-taught enough to actually become a practicing architect. Or he recommended there be licensing, but it was, of course, that far back, it wasn't required. But people as late as the 1800s were reading his books. In fact, they're still in most architecture departments in the United States. Some of his work is taught as part of the history of architecture. So I'll say it again, that makes him, most historians agree, the father of the modern profession of architecture, because before that, there was no consistent training that you were supposed to go through. So he kind of upped the, skill level of architects who followed after him if they used his ideas. And then the other thing is that he invented details. Whoops, I always likes doing that. Details in some of his architecture that were copied for centuries. And some of you may know, if you ever drove through or seen movies even filmed in the South, or even other parts of the United States, New England, the colonial era architecture, or even into the early 1800s after the Revolution, many of those houses, so some of them in the South obviously were plantation houses, but in the North they were just homes for merchants or whoever, town leaders of the local church or what have you. They used the style of architecture invented by Palladio, and we call that Georgian. You don't have to know that, but just say the influence of his style remained popular throughout Europe and North America, both, for centuries. So let's talk about just the other part of the meeting is, well, what did he use on this building that was so new? First of all, multiple porticos. Before that, one portico was it. You had the entrance, and then you walked under the portico to get to the door. This has porticos on all four sides. I don't know if you can tell, there's one sticking out there. The White House is an example of his influence. No question, the White House in Washington. It only has the two porticos, one on the front, one on the back, but still that's part of his influence. He felt they gave elegance and some kind of a balance, symmetry, right? Which is the whole concept of Renaissance architecture. He didn't invent that, but the idea of using multiple matching, right? The same shape and height and style. Porticos, at least two, and in some cases 4 porticos. So multiple porticos, that's something he introduced. Another thing is, on a private residence, it's called, the name of this building, Villa Rotunda, for a reason. A rotunda is a domed space below an open room, right? And of course, most of you know the most famous rotunda in the US is the US Capitol building in Washington. But if you've never been to San Francisco City Hall, of course, now you have to go through metal detectors, and I guess you have to have an appointment to get in there. But you've seen movies filmed, I don't know if you have, filmed in San Francisco, or even just, photos of it. And one of you or two of you might want to write a paper about a building, the Capitol building in Sacramento, the state Capitol. They all have rotundas. So he came up with the idea. He didn't invent rotundas. No, that's something that predates him. But doing that on a private residence, that was unheard of. So this is a rotunda on a private person's home or residence, a residential structure with rotunda. And then the other thing he did was to take these decorative sculptures and make them symbolic or allegorical. They had some meaning for the family. You don't need to know, and I don't even know all the details, so we don't need to go into that, what each sculpture means, but they had a particular meaning that the owner of the house, who was the client who commissioned, of course, Palladio to design their residence, would have, asked for those sculptures to have. So the idea of using sculptures is both decorative detailing along the exterior, not just around the doorway, right, or inside, or on the grounds, but you see them on top here of the porticos. So using them on the exterior, especially along the roof line or the porticos, because that is the roof of the porch, right? Portico means porch, right, with columns. That idea of those sculptures having also a symbolic meaning as well as a decorative use is something he created. Okay, it's plenty on the meaning. Let's do a quick formal analysis. It's balanced. Yeah, it's completely symmetrical, as all Renaissance architecture would be, left to right. But of course, with the dome, or sorry, it actually is a kind of a dome, but the right word is rotunda. that is narrower than the whole area below the roof. So obviously it's unbalanced toward the bottom. And then the rhythm here with the columns, the windows, the statues, very strong rhythms. The textures are all real except on the sculpture, but you can't see those. So you can just keep to the structure itself. It's real smooth plaster, a real rough stone on the foundation, and real smooth tile on the roof, and finally real smooth glass. So there's 4 real textures. The modeling is always in a building, real shadows created by the sun around the windows mostly. And then it's stable on the walls. Most of the building is stable, but the rotunda is dynamic, and so are the roofs of the porticos, right? The triangular shape there. I couldn't tell you what that's called, a pediment, but you don't have to know that word for this class. If you're taking ancient art history, we talk about Greek temples, you wouldn't need to know. But that triangular space there, obviously that's a dynamic angle. So on top of the porticos in the rotunda are dynamic, everything else is stable. For space, it's one large open domed room or rotunda, right, with many smaller rooms arranged around that space. That's all you have to write. And it is a 2-story building. It may look 3, but that's actually a basement where servants do the work and cook and things. So really, it's considered a 2-story home with one large open room below a rotunda and other smaller rooms. Okay, and then line is always the visual line created by the shadows. There's no painted, or at least here. Well, the only carving is the name. Yeah, that's the name of the family that had it built. Other than that, all the line is visual. The largest mass is the main section of the building, then the porticos, and then the rotunda. Okay. Now I'm going to cut one of these, so I'm going to go ahead and tell you which one. I love this painting, but we have to cut something, and I promised that I would do that so we can get caught up by the end of this lecture. So everyone take your pen out and cross out Return of the Hunters by Bruegel. It's a great painting by a great painter, but if we have to cut something, I just chose this one. So since it's not on the syllabus, I won't go over that unless people have questions about it. But this one, I decided to leave. So it's a last Mannerist painting we're going to see, and then we're going to start on Baroque, because that is the topic we need to have covered by, we have the next 3 lectures on Baroque. It's a major category it'll be the last new topic or style of art before the midterm. But this is the last Mannerist slide. Okay, The Last Supper. I know some of you, didn't we already see? Yes, that was the Da Vinci version. Very different. Same title though, The Last Supper. The artist's name is Tintoretto, Tintoretto. Again, Tintoretto, 1594. That was a nickname. They meant little tinter. His father was a tinter. He tinted. His father had a successful business of tinting cloth, for every purpose, clothing, whatever else, banners. And he was the son of a tinter, so he was called the little tinter, Tintoretto. He's also from Venice. So I think that's not a minor detail, because Venice wasn't known as the birthplace of the Renaissance, nor was it the most powerful, important city in Italy. Of course, that was Rome. But it was the wealthiest city in Italy, and it could afford to commission people in Venice, could afford to commission really great painters, and Tintoretto was one of the best. He helped use this. Some of you already noticed this if you're looking at this closely before we do the formal elements and finishing up. But for the meaning, his signature motifs, here they are, is the main part of the meaning here. I mean, obviously it's a scene when Jesus, that's him with the brightest halo, right, is with his disciples right before he gets arrested, and one of them has betrayed him. And by the way, there he is, that's Judas, skulking away, right? So it shows all of his disciples at the table just before Jesus is arrested. That's the same as the meaning of the scene from the Bible as the Da Vinci version. But there, the similarity ends. Okay, how so? Well, here are his 3 signature motifs. An oblique angle, a sharp, you could say, angle, or very strong diagonal. But in one word, to keep it brief, it's O-B-L-I-Q-U-E, not O-B-L-L-E-E-K. So oblique, right? Odd or sharp angle is a signature motif that was way ahead of its time. Artist in the 1800s, Impressionists and others were influenced by the Japanese. You'll see that when we get to the Impressionists. They were using it all over the place, but that's 300 years later. So here we have an oblique angle. I mean, why did he do this? Why did he make it not the obvious common view of us sitting here as a viewer across from the table looking straight at the way Da Vinci did? Partly just to be different, but also because it draws your eye in. So he used the oblique angle to get your interest, or the viewer's interest or attention, drawn into the scene more so than it might if it was just a straight head-on view. So oblique angles, one of his three signature motifs. Another is an extreme chiaroscuro. Now that he borrowed from Da Vinci, but he did it even more so. He not only did he do it in the background, you see it here on these figures at the end of the table. Look, they're fading into the blackness behind them. That's, again, I'll say it, his second signature motif is an extreme use of chiaroscuro, or, you know, sharply contrasting light and dark. And he used the dark to almost overlap some of the, at least many of the main figures. And it's even true in some ways on the fronts of these disciples, the closest to us. But my favorite, his third signature motif, and the last one to write now for the meaning of this, is that he would use mysterious or mythical creatures around the borders of his paintings. What are these? Are these ghosts? Are they angels coming from heaven? Are they demons? You know, because this is a, you know, a moment of betrayal, right, with Judas there. We don't know. They're mysterious, mythical creatures, and they're coming out of the oil lamp, literally flying out of the oil lamp and circling around. So around the edges of some, usually in this case, just the upper part of the painting around the ceiling, he would use these strange mythical creatures. Okay, so that's the whole meaning on this. Oh, well, there's one more fact that should be obvious. This is not your typical scene for that part of the Bible. This is a dive. There's no other word for it. This bar, or whatever it was, inn, that's probably the right word, is definitely not an upscale play. The floor is filthy. People are dressed really casually. And obviously, that's what these people, the disciples, Jesus and disciples, couldn't afford anything fancier. So it's more likely to be the kind of place where this event occurred, where this Last Supper actually happened, than the scenes you see in, even including Da Vinci's, where everything is more, you know, neat and clean and tidy. He's saying, I don't think that's the way it was. So that's not a signature motif. He didn't do that all the time. But in this painting, he wanted to make that statement, that he thought of it as a more likely, a lowbrow place. Okay, formal analysis, pretty easy. I think it's balanced very carefully, because this group of figures is just about the same area as this group, and then Jesus just about straddles the middle. And then this group of angels, or whatever they are in this group here, roughly equal. If you see it differently, I wouldn't argue, but it does seem to be weighted toward the bottom, though, because of the empty space along the walls. There's, of course, foreshortening, diminishing size, overlapping, and no question of scientific perspective. Those are the four techniques used here. The lines are all thin outlines. The modeling, I just already said, in the background is super strong, but it is also sharp and realistic on the main figures here, including the serving staff. And so is the texture on the clothing, the hair, the skin. I would say it's dynamic and stable. I used to say more stable than dynamic, but it's not really quite the case. Jesus is bending over slightly, though his disciples are mixed, some standing. So if you want to make the case, because when you add these figures up along the ceiling, more of the figures in the painting are dynamic. That it's more dynamic than stable. I wouldn't dispute that. The largest mass, well, it's probably a close call between the floor and the walls, but you can't see much of the wall. So maybe between the floor and the table. And then it would be these two serving people here. They're larger than the disciples because they're closer to us. Okay, and the colors, of course, a mixture of warm and cool, obviously cool on the blues and warm on the reds and oranges of the clothing. Okay, now we're going to do the stop share. Just take a second and go to Baroque. Okay. And the Baroque, I'll give you the definition for Baroque. It has four. If you take out you should have your terms always every evening, right? Or every, right, this is the afternoon class, sorry. Four main features of Baroque art. I will give those to you right now. Hang on. The first one is bulbous shapes. Bulbous shapes. Whoops, sorry. I'm gonna get this just pulled up here. Okay, bulbous rounded. I should add rounded. I'll say it again, my apologies. Bulbous, B-U-L-B-O-U-S, meaning fat and rounded. So bulbous or rounded with an ED shapes. That you'll see throughout all of the slides of Baroque painting and architecture. It's true of all Baroque art. Baroque isn't only a style for painting. It was used for all visual arts. Okay, let's see. Hopefully this will enlarge here. Okay, oh, I forgot to do that. Hang on. Yeah, I have to do the restore down. Hang on. I know it takes, not restore down, I mean the screen share. There we go. First, so you can see it. Okay. Can everybody see this now?
Uh-huh.
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. Okay, this is not a must-know. I'm going to start out slow. Baroque, again, the second feature, I gave you the first. Everyone has that of the four elements. See, this might appear on the true-false part of the, I might say Baroque art includes and lists 3 or 4 things, and one might be not correct, and that would be false. That's how the definitions will appear in a true-false section on the midterm and the final. Okay, so I already gave you the first one. The second feature is an encrustation of ornamentation. Well, I'm going to prove that to you inside this building, which is a palace for the kings and queens of France before Versailles was built. This is hundreds of years, or 150 years older. And that you can see inside on these decorations along the wall, these sculptural details of this. It's called Fontainebleau, which was the most lavish of all the royal palaces until Versailles was built 100 and some years later. So the second, I'll repeat that, second feature of Baroque art is an encrustation, it's my own phrase, an encrust, as an E-N, encrustation of ornamentation. I hope that's easy to remember because when you get up close, look at that. Every square inch of this piece, except a little tiny bit behind, below her knees there, these two women's knees, everything else is covered with ornament. That's classically Baroque. They're often called Baroque details, but an encrustation ornamentation is how I like to put it. Okay. The third feature of all Baroque art is an unseen presence. Well, the unseen presence here would be the king, because you weren't going to get to see the king unless you were very important. If you just showed up to try and, ask for help with some problem, you might get into the palace, but you probably wouldn't going to see the king unless you knew someone, right? In any case, the king didn't hang out in the lobby of his own, or even the library. Look at this library. It's incredibly Baroque. The ornamentation here, and even the ceiling is bulbous and rounded. Of course, curved is another way of saying that, but curved implies just a single curve. Everything in a Baroque building or Baroque painting, not everything, but most of the parts have this bulbous rounded shape. Okay, so then what's the fourth feature? A strong emotional component. I'll repeat that, a strong emotional component. And that's what we're going to see here with, I'm going to have to go all the way to the end because the slide librarian, somehow she decided to put it at the very end, the first must know. So I'm going to go back to it. Unfortunately, you can't, you know how it works. Some of you, if you've done these, toward the end, you end up with, oh, there we go. Here it is. This is the first must know. This is one of the most famous paintings in the history of art. And I imagine most of you haven't seen it unless you happen to have been to Rome. It's in a church in Rome. It's our first must know. It's the Calling of St. Matthew. The Calling of St. Matthew. The artist's name is Caravaggio. Caravaggio. Yes, those Italians, they're multi-syllabic last names. They're always 4 or 5 syllables. Again, Caravaggio, Caravaggio, 1602. This is considered the first famous Baroque painting by the first great Baroque painter. There's no other way to say that. That summarizes in a nutshell why it's so famous and so important, so influential. It changed the course of painting in Europe, this artist and this painting. Again, the first famous Baroque painting by the greatest Baroque painter. Not anybody I know would argue, no historian would argue with that. Well, it has all four elements is the reason why that mark it as Baroque. For instance, the unseen presence here. Now, at first glance, you're going to think, oh, I see it very clearly. But when you get up close to this, you don't notice Jesus's body. In fact, well, this one actually gets that across pretty well. You see just his head and his hand as though they were floating in space. Now, this is a digitally enhanced image. It's not one I would have chosen to use, because if you stand in front of this painting like I have, for several minutes, you have to really strain to see, oh, that's Jesus, his whole body and his head and arms are attached and he's in the shadows. It's not meant to be obvious. The painter here, the artist, is not trying to make you focus on Jesus. So the unseen presence here, you could see nearly unseen, is Jesus, the rest of Jesus' body, if you want to write it that way. And then even here with Peter, his first disciple, the guy with the gray hair standing in front of him, you don't see his face. Here, it's even more out here. This is a better view, yeah. You don't see his face much unless you look really closely, and the rest of his body from around above his waist below you. So the unseen presence, or two things, are both Jesus, or most of his body, and most of Peter's. But where is the emotional impact or effect? Surprise, shock. Why? Because this is a scene from the Bible in which Jesus came into a lowbrow tavern, a down and out, dive is the right word, and tries to get Matthew, that's the second one of all of his disciples, to join him after Peter was Matthew, according to Matthew was a tax collector for the Romans. He was working for the occupiers, for the enemy. And Jesus was telling him, stop collecting money from your own people for the oppressors, for the Romans. Come join me and live in the streets. Well, that's the shock, is the reaction. The emotional component here is disbelief. This guy's saying, what, you want this guy here who's obviously happy being a tax collector, counting the money and, earning a good living. You want him to give it all up and go with you and be a beggar? Come on, it's shock and disbelief is the emotional component. Okay, and then the incrustation ornamentation really shows as you get close. The money on the table, their fancy clothing, the feathers in his hat. Look at the sleeves on this guy's, jacket here. And then even on the window, you don't want to know what bodily fluids are on that glass. But let me just say, they're every kind of bodily fluid known to the human race. This place hasn't been cleaned. Those windows definitely haven't been in probably years, right? So that's the part of the meaning of the painting. That's not what makes it Baroque. Well, it is, because it's an incrustation only of things that are not mentionable. Okay, I can't mention them. You can do the math or imaginary what those liquids might have been and where they came from. I mean, this place would have seen, all kinds of illicit activity over the years. That these incrustation here of, crud, if you want to call it that, on the windows is part of what, of course, is one of the elements of Baroque. And then finally, we have the bulbous. Well, everything. Look at this. This guy's sleeves on his jacket, their hats with the feathers forming curved lines, of course, their legs, right, even under the table, quite a bit, at least the four figures at the table, five figures at the table, have bulbous shapes and lines to their body parts, what we can see of them, and their clothing. So this is a classic Baroque piece, but there's one more thing that's a signature motif that is invented, or was invented, by Caravaggio. No one had done before, and that is the spotlight effect. The sun's coming through, right, a window somewhere off the edge of the painting, and it's hitting the main figures here at the table. right? The ones Jesus is pointing past to tell Matthew. Some people think this is Matthew, but Matthew was a young man, and this guy is the one counting the money. There's a debate over that, but let's just say keep it simple, many historians believe that Matthew is the one at the end of the table. He fits the description of age-wise, and also he's counting the money. And the head guy who's doing the collecting and his assistants would give him the money, and then he'd count it. That makes sense. So this is what just say many historians believe that's Matthew, and this is one of his is pointing at him saying, "You want this guy to give that fancy, rich lifestyle? No way." Well, of course he did, according to the Bible. He came with Jesus. Okay, so that spotlight, that's the right way to read it. There's no other phrase for that. Spotlight effect is an exaggerated form of chiaroscuro invented by Caravaggio. No question, he invented that technique, and you'll see it throughout the rest of the Baroque slides, in painting at least. It's almost as though he had spotlights. They didn't exist, but he had candles that had reflecting power that could make the same kind of intense light that a modern spotlight can. So when we say a spotlight effect, it's not really an exaggeration. He came up with that idea. It's a signature motif, very much so, as well as painting scenes like this in dives or rundown places where he believed these events occurred. Okay, formal analysis is, let's do this quickly. It is balanced. We'll do one more must know. We'll see if we have time for two, probably only one more. And then I'll stay to take questions. It's unbalanced toward the bottom. I would say roughly balanced left to right, although the window is slightly off center. If you feel that makes it unbalanced toward the left, toward the right, I wouldn't argue with that. The rhythm is obvious with the hats, the clothing, the legs below the table, of course, the heads of all the figures, arms and hands. The symmetric texture, again, it's a given. Baroque is really another phase of Renaissance. You don't have to write that, but it's just a more detailed and ornate, some would say, or decorative phase, a more emotional and decorative phase of Renaissance. So some people just call it late Renaissance, but the right word is Baroque. And almost every history text, art history text will use that term. So this has all the same elements of a realistic Renaissance painting. Super sharp symmetry texture on the clothing, the hair, even on the scum, I'll call it scum, on the window. As well as, of course, on their faces and hands. And then also the same thing with the modeling. But here the modeling also should be mentioned if this is on the midterm. And I'm not cutting this. I'm sorry, I apologize. I didn't say that at the start of this slide. It's very important. I'm not going to cut it from the study list. It's such an influential slide. This is chiaroscuro, and of course, that's a kind of modeling. So he uses the modeling in more ways than one here. All the lines are thin outlines. And then the largest mass, well, you decide. Is it the wall, if that's one mass, perhaps? And then which figure do you see the most of? Perhaps the guy sitting at the end of the table? Or you see enough of Peter's body once you start looking closely in deep shadows of where his legs are. Maybe he's the largest mass. Or even Matthew at the end here. So you could decide that. And for overlapping, for space, I'm sorry, the techniques are overlapping, foreshortening, of course, on the table and the shutter. I wouldn't say there's diminishing size here, right? And there's no scientific perspective or atmospheric perspective. So it's just foreshortening and overlapping. And of course, the rhythm is powerful. And is it stable or dynamic? Well, by definition, Baroque art is dynamic on all the bulbous details. But these figures are kind of sitting upright here, at least these three. And Jesus, what you can see of him, just his head and his arm, he's standing upright. The window is stable, but there are a lot of dynamic details, obviously, on the hats and the clothing. So we're going to go now to the second must know, which is an equally important one, and I won't be cutting it, and it's the, we're almost there, Bernini. Okay, this one, make special extra careful notes on because it has a very high possibility of being on the midterm. Okay, this is the Colonnade of St. Peter's. Colonnade is C-O-L-O-N-N-A-D-E. Colonnade of St. Peter's, of course, with an apostrophe S. The architect's name is Bernini, B-E-R-N-I-N-I. Bernini, 1657. Well, some of you recognize this from just, photos and movies and all kinds of film and news reports from Rome. This is where the Pope lives. And this is St. Peter's, the church. But it's not the church that you'd be writing about. If it's on the exam, I will give you a clue about that, because some people mix that up and then miss the entire answer. We're not talking about the church, but Bernini didn't design that. It's the colonnade in front of it. Some say colonnades plural, but most texts just call it a single colonnade because it's two sections of the same design. Okay, so what is that supposed to symbolize? Well, I bet one or two of you might have some idea. If you think of this as symbolic, these two curved sections here, and we're looking at it from, of course, up above, probably a helicopter view, right? And if you look at this is the church, the head church of the Catholic religion, right? It is the largest church in the world. So then in front of it, you have these structures which curve outward, and people can come into the plaza. 200,000 people can fit in this plaza at one time. And usually on Christmas and Easter, when the Pope comes out and makes his, statements in 10 languages, is usually his multiple languages, the crowds become quite large. You can hold up to 200,000 people in this plaza. So can anybody what does it look to you like, anybody, that these might symbolize? Parts
the hands of God.
Well, that's in the ballpark in a way. Well, let's say a part of the anatomy.
Yeah, a womb.
It's like a hug, like a
yes, perfect, excellent. Yes, it's like the arms of the Mother Church embracing, or you could say hugging, the faithful. Those who come here are almost, well, not everybody who comes here is Catholic, of course, but majority of those who come to hear the Pope are Catholic. So I'll say it again. This is meant, these two colonnades are meant to symbolize the arms of the Mother Church, because that is the Mother Church, right? The main church, the headquarters of the Catholic religion. These colonnades are meant to symbolize the arms of Mother Church embracing the faithful. That's an actual phrase used, I believe, by Bernini to describe his idea. Well, it's a brilliant concept, and it has that effect on a lot of people. And then the other thing is, of course, for the purpose is to have large crowds gather in front of the church to hear the Pope speak. And that's done quite. I don't know if anybody saw Angels and Demons with Tom Hanks. Anybody see that movie? Anyway,
yes.
Well, yeah, it was a pretty good movie. Yeah, I thought so. The special effects and things. Yeah, in the end, there's this whole thing about disaster coming from the sky, and they have a huge. I guess they paid a lot of people to be extras in that, or maybe they were just CGI. Anyway, I've been in that plaza when there's been 100,000, and then it's only half full. So it's a pretty impressive space. It's no longer one of the largest public plazas. It was when it was built. Then now there's, Red Square can hold 300,000 in Moscow, and Tiananmen Square in Beijing can hold, 300,000 or 400,000. And there's probably bigger ones. So probably Kim Il-jung in North Korea has an even bigger. But it just say it is certainly one of the largest public plazas in the world, even now. And then the very last thing about it, of course, is the style. It is Baroque, so Baroque it hurts. Let's get up close, and you'll see there are sculptures here. It's got the bulbous effect, of course, the arms hugging, as you were saying, that one person said is an excellent way of putting it, or embracing people. Those are curved bulbous shapes. But the same is true when you get up close to the sculpture. Every one of these columns has a statue of a saint. Back then, there were only 200. Now, I don't know how many. The Catholic churches, I'm a lapsed Catholic, but it's been a long time since I've read that. I know it's several hundred saints, or they so-called declared people saints right after they die. So here are statues of past saints. And of course, they are an incrustation on top of the columns, or an incrustation of ornamentation. The emotional component here is religious faith or fervor or devotion. Probably devotion is a better word. Religious faith or devotion. You're supposed to feel when you're there, if you're Catholic especially, or even just in general, if you're so inclined. So religious faith or devotion is the strong emotional component, and the unseen presence would be God, right? God supposedly looking down. Now, sometimes it's a Pope, but then that's when he's not speaking, and this plaza is meant to hold people when he comes out to talk. That's why it's so large. Then he's not unseen. Well, maybe he's so far away, you have to use binoculars. But the unseen presence is God here. So it's got all the four elements that mark something as Baroque. But let's talk now about the, let's go back and do the formal analysis. If it's on the exam, this is the view you'll have. So you've got balance, what's completely symmetrical. All Renaissance architecture, almost all Renaissance architecture is, no matter what, whether it's colonnades, a church, a palace, just things have symmetry in the Renaissance designs. Okay, and then we have the rhythm of the columns and the statues, of course, and the two arms are identical. The colors are warm on the tile and cool marble on all of the sculpture or statues and the columns. For space, the columns are about 60 feet high. And then they enclose a plaza, so it's real space. The two dimensions are the height of the columns, about 60 feet, and the capacity of the plaza, about 200,000. Okay, and then it's dynamic on the curves right here, but stable on the columns, on the arms, if you want to say that. And so it's both, about equally. So there's no larger or smaller mass, they're equal. The two equal masses on either side, exact same number of columns and same length and of course height. The textures are simulated on the sculpture. You don't have to describe them, they're too far away, of course. But smooth real textures of marble on the columns and smooth real texture of clay tile on the roofs. And of course, those are warm. I think I mentioned that. Yeah, and cool on the columns. Let's see, are we missing something here? Balance, stable. There's no line visible, but there are carved lines on the statues. But you can just say that it just forms visual lines around the edges. I'm going to do one thing. Now, I think I've covered all the elements here. Yeah, since there's no line. Yeah, just for about 90 seconds or less, just to show you what it's like to go there. These are the columns. This guy was 7 feet tall. He was a soccer coach from Manchester, England. I know because I heard him talking to his team. And this is his wife. And look how tall the columns are. He's 7 feet tall and he's, dwarfed by these 60-foot tall columns. This is within the colonnade, which people usually use in the summer because it's hot and there's no shade. It's the only thing I don't like about Rome. A beautiful city, but hardly any trees. You'll find that out if you go there in the hot months of the year. It's best to go in the cool part of the year if you have a choice. And then inside St. Peter's, these are slides that I took. Look how, this is the largest church in the world. It's over 600 feet long. So if you were to, it's longer than 2 football fields, 650 feet. A football field is 300 feet long, right? At least that's the last time I checked. 100 yards, yeah. And so you've got the equivalent of 2 football fields plus space behind. Well, what's that in the background? Well, we'll end up with this. That's the Pope's canopy, it's called, where when he speaks inside the church on Christmas and Easter Day, he gives these, sermons, or what do I call them, talks, supposedly to the whole world, or whoever's listening in the cameras. Of course, they're always recorded. And then this is, Bernini designed this too. These are black marble columns with real gold bees buzzing around on the columns. And those are often nicknamed, they're spiral columns, they spiral upward. Bernini columns, as though he invented them, but actually he copied them from ancient Rome. Some Roman temples use those kind of columns. But he designed this whole, it's over 40 feet high, and it's meant to, evoke or symbolize the importance of the Pope while he sits there and talks to the audience. They didn't use it for over a year and a half during, well, actually, I think they're using it again now. So almost a year and a half because of the pandemic. Okay, so we're at 4:20. Let's see if you have any questions at this point. I'm going to stop the share now. Any questions at all about what we've covered or previous lectures? Well, those are already on, posted on YouTube, of course, and or your papers. Anybody? You guys know what you're going to do now, right? You should be working on the research, if not actually writing. But now is a good time. That's just why I always, these are my informal office hours, as well as by arrangement over the phone or through email. And of course, if you have questions about your paper, don't wait till the day it's due, which is 9 days, I started to say. Not 10 days or 12, 9 days from today, a week from Wednesday, the 22nd, that's where the twos come in. And they're due by midnight on that day. So any questions you have now is a good time to ask about those papers and research, or any extra credit queries or options you might be considering. Anybody? I'll wait. Anybody have any? This is your chance to ask questions if there's something urgent that you need to know or want to know right now. Anybody else?
I guess this isn't urgent, but I have two random ones, if that's okay.
Sure. Go ahead.
Was the first one we looked at, the Durer, was that engraved in like wood, or did they use
Oh,
stone?
that's a good question. I should have mentioned it. Excellent question. No one has to add this to their notes. You've done enough notes. It's a copper. He did some in wood, but the most detailed and finest lines have to be carved into metal. And copper works best. And you know how hard that would be to carve lines with a sharp. Of course, you had sharp tools. Obviously, you had to keep them sharp and maybe buy a bunch of them because they'd wear out. They're called a burin, B-U-R-E-N. Yeah, that was a metal. I believe copper is the only kind of metal he used. But of course, it was expensive even back then. So he might have occasionally used other kinds of metal. They didn't have steel then, right? So it would probably be copper. And woodcut engravings can't get as detailed, at least usually the number of lines are just not as many per square inch.
Yeah.
That's a good point.
Okay.
Good question. Yeah. Okay, any others? All right. Give it one more minute pace because people think of things sometimes right before we sign off. So I will see you all. We'll continue with Baroque art on Wednesday, but I will check my email regularly, of course, for any questions that someone thinks of before the next class, or if they have a section of the paper they want me to look at, I always will give you that option. Of course, don't, as they said, please don't, if you want me to give you feedback, don't wait till the day before or less than 48 hours before you do that. Okay, so by Monday at the latest, if you send me something, I can get back to you before it's due. Okay, I guess we covered everything. One more time, any questions?
Hey, Mark, one quick question before we end up. Chiaroscuro, is that synonymous with tenebralism, or is it very similar?
No, you've got me. That is, I sort of know what you're asking, but I don't want to speak about, I have never used that term in my classes or my syllabus or my terms to know.
When I
what
was
is your understanding of the meaning of tenebralism?
Well, when I was doing research, so I have a work that I'm doing my paper on, and it's the Night Watch.
Oh, yeah.
And it talks about Rembrandt being taught by his teacher in tenebralism, which is the heavy use of heavy light dark contrast, which he borrowed
it's another
from,
term for
and which he borrowed. They called it Caravaggio-esque techniques.
Yeah.
So it sounds pretty similar to me. Okay, cool. Just wanted to check. Thank you.
Yeah, it's exactly that. No, that's a good question. And I have to admit, I wouldn't have thought to use that term. I probably will incorporate it if I remember in my next lecture. Just so those of you who've done research, see if you see that term and you're writing about a painting that has that technique, you don't get confused or otherwise, uncertain if that's acceptable. But for this class, it's safer to stick to the terms that are on the syllabus, the handouts, and of course the list of 9 elements of composition. Okay, any other questions?
I guess I have a really specific one that might not really matter.
Okay.
In the Last Supper, the one that we looked at today, like you were talking about how he used unique viewpoints and oblique angles and stuff.
Yeah.
So when I first saw that, I might have assumed like in the beginning that's like, oh, that's a diagonal line with that table right in the middle and everything. Like that would think of dynamic, but then I know like obviously if it was straight on, it would look like right angles and stuff. So is there like a hard right or wrong answer about whether that particular technique makes something dynamic?
Another good question. I would allow you some discretion, but frankly, what you see on the plane of the photo, painting, drawing, or whatever, if the line forms, and it does in that one, of course, any oblique angle in a painting or drawing or photo is going to have a diagonal to at least most of the objects, or certainly the table there, and the floor even, right? So that makes it dynamic from our viewer's perspective. I would do that. Yeah.
Okay, awesome. Thank you.
Yeah. good point. Okay. Anybody else? One last time. Okay, we'll see
Thank you.
all you guys on, yeah, well, thank you too. All of you, and I'll see you guys all on Wednesday from my office on the San Jose campus. Okay, take care.